When a woman tells a man certain things in a relationship, it is not always casual talk. Sometimes it is communication, sometimes it is emotion, and sometimes it is a clear signal about how she sees the relationship and how she values the man in front of her. Many men miss these signals because they focus on attachment instead of interpretation. They hear the words, but do not understand the direction those words point toward. In modern dating, communication is faster, emotions are more direct, and patience for confusion is lower. What a woman says can reveal whether she is building with you, testing you, or slowly disconnecting from you. There are moments when a woman expresses herself in ways that seem small on the surface, but carry deeper meaning about respect, interest, and emotional investment. Some statements reflect frustration, some reflect loss of attraction, and some reflect a shift in priorities where you are no longer central in her emotional world. The danger for most men is not hearing these words but normalizing them. Once disrespect, emotional distance, or low interest is accepted as normal, the dynamic begins to change permanently. This topic is about awareness, not paranoia, not control, but clarity. When a woman reaches a certain emotional point, she communicates it. If a man understands what those signals mean, he can recognize when the connection is still healthy and when it is quietly breaking down. The goal is not to react emotionally, but to see patterns early and respond with self-respect and awareness. What follows are 7 specific things a woman may say that often indicate deeper shifts in attraction, respect, or emotional alignment. Each one carries meaning beyond the words themselves. Understanding them gives you perspective on when to engage, when to correct the dynamic, and when distance becomes the healthier choice. 1. I don't know if I still want this. When a woman says she does not know if she still wants the relationship, it is rarely a sudden thought that appears at that moment. It is usually the result of internal emotional processing that has been building over time. This statement signals emotional uncertainty, and uncertainty in attraction is one of the most dangerous stages in a relationship dynamic. At this point, her mind is no longer fully anchored in emotional certainty about you or the connection. She is evaluating how she feels when she is with you compared to how she feels when she is alone or interacting with others. This comparison creates emotional instability. When a woman is deeply connected, she speaks with clarity about direction. She may have concerns, but she still has emotional commitment. When she begins to question whether she still wants it, her emotional attachment is weakening, and her mental space is opening for alternatives. This is not always about another person, but about emotional disconnection that creates room for doubt. In modern dating, emotional clarity is a key indicator of interest. Confusion means the emotional reward is no longer strong enough to override uncertainty. When she voices this, she is often testing both herself and you. Internally, she is asking whether the relationship still gives her emotional value, stability, or excitement. At the same time, she is observing your reaction. If you respond with panic, over-explanation, or emotional pressure, it often confirms her internal fear that the dynamic is unstable. If you respond with calm presence and self-control, it creates space for her to reflect more clearly, but it does not guarantee restoration of attraction. The key point is that this statement reflects internal distance already created before it was spoken. Many men misinterpret it as the beginning of the problem, but it is usually the result of earlier emotional shifts that were not addressed. These shifts include reduced attraction, emotional inconsistency, lack of excitement, or feeling misunderstood over time. When those accumulate, her emotional certainty decreases until it reaches a verbal expression like this. Once she says it out loud, the emotional phase has already moved into questioning rather than building. At this stage, she is not fully in and not fully out. She is suspended between emotional attachment and emotional withdrawal. This is why her behavior may also feel inconsistent, sometimes warm and sometimes distant. That inconsistency reflects her internal conflict. The more unresolved the emotional experience, the stronger the uncertainty becomes. If nothing changes in the emotional experience, her mind will continue moving toward resolution on its own, which often leads to emotional separation. This statement is not just communication. It is a reflection of internal disengagement that has already started to form quietly before being spoken. 2. You don't make me feel anything. When a woman says you do not make her feel anything, it is one of the clearest signs that emotional attraction has dropped to a critical level. Attraction in modern dating is driven heavily by emotional stimulation, not logic or obligation. If she reaches a point where she openly expresses emotional numbness, it means the connection no longer activates her feelings in a meaningful way. This statement is not about one single moment. It is the result of repeated interactions that no longer create emotional highs, curiosity, tension, or excitement. Over time, what once felt engaging may have become predictable, routine, or emotionally flat. When that happens, the brain stops producing strong emotional responses in your presence. A woman does not need constant intensity, but she does need emotional variation that keeps her engaged. When that is missing, she begins to feel detached, even if she still spends time with you. Saying she does not feel anything is her way of putting language to emotional absence. At this stage, her mind is comparing how she feels with you to how she feels when she is stimulated elsewhere, whether through conversations, environments, or new experiences. If those outside experiences feel more emotionally alive, your presence starts to lose significance. This statement also shows that her emotional system has already reduced attachment. It is not the beginning of disconnection, it is the recognition of it. Many men misunderstand this and try to force emotion back through attention, gifts, or explanations. That approach rarely restores attraction because attraction is not rebuilt through pressure. It is rebuilt through emotional reset and changed perception. When a woman says this, she is also revealing something important about her internal state. She is no longer emotionally invested enough to protect your feelings. That honesty, even if it feels harsh, is a form of emotional distance. She is expressing reality as she experiences it, without filtering it for comfort. In many cases, she has already started mentally stepping away before saying it out loud. The statement becomes a confirmation of what she already feels internally. At this point, the emotional bond is weakened to the level where presence alone is no longer enough to create connection. She may still respond, still engage, or still stay around physically, but emotionally she is no longer activated. This creates a gap between behavior and feeling that becomes increasingly visible over time. If nothing shifts in the emotional dynamic, her mind will naturally seek experiences that restore feeling elsewhere. That does not always mean another person immediately, but it does mean her emotional focus will move away from the relationship. Once emotional numbness is acknowledged, the relationship is no longer in a building phase. It is in a decline phase unless something fundamentally changes in how she experiences you emotionally. 3. I need space from you. When a woman says she needs space from you, it is a clear indication that the emotional dynamic between you has become overwhelming, confusing, or unfulfilling for her current state of mind. Space is not always about physical distance. It is about emotional reset. At this stage, she is trying to separate herself from the emotional influence of the relationship so she can think more clearly about how she truly feels. This usually happens when emotions are no longer stable and the connection feels heavy rather than enjoyable. In healthy attraction, closeness feels natural and desired. When she asks for space, closeness has started to feel like pressure or emotional noise. Her mind is trying to regain balance by stepping away from the source of emotional intensity or emotional confusion. This does not always mean the relationship is over at that moment, but it does mean she is no longer comfortable staying in the same emotional rhythm. She is creating distance so she can observe her feelings without immediate influence from you. In many cases, this request is already preceded by silent withdrawal, reduced communication, or emotional detachment that has not been openly expressed. The request for space is simply the verbal confirmation of what her behavior has already started doing. During this period, she is often evaluating how she feels when you are not actively present in her emotional space. She notices whether she feels relief mixed with longing, or complete indifference. These reactions become indicators for her internal decision-making. If she feels more calm and less emotionally burdened without contact, her mind begins to associate distance with comfort. If she feels a sense of missing emotional connection, there may still be attachment present. However, the key factor is whether that attachment is strong enough to pull her back or weak enough to fade. Many men react to this statement by trying to reduce space, increase communication, or prove emotional value. This often has the opposite effect because it reinforces the feeling that she needs even more distance to think freely. At this stage, emotional pressure is interpreted as lack of awareness of her internal state. What she is actually asking for is mental clarity without influence, not persuasion or reassurance. Space gives her mind the opportunity to process unresolved feelings, unmet expectations, and emotional patterns without immediate reaction. It is a form of emotional distancing that allows her to reset her perception of the relationship. If attraction and emotional connection were strong before this stage, space can sometimes create reflection that brings clarity and reconnection. If the emotional foundation was already weak, space often accelerates detachment because absence becomes more comfortable than presence. This statement is not neutral. It is a turning point where emotional direction begins to shift, either toward reconnection through clarity or separation through detachment. 4. I don't feel respect anymore. When a woman says she does not feel respect anymore, it signals a deep breakdown in the emotional foundation of the relationship. Respect and attraction is not only about manners or politeness, it is about how she perceives your behavior, consistency, decision-making, and emotional presence over time. When this statement appears, it means her perception of you has shifted downward in a meaningful way. She no longer sees your actions in the same positive frame she once did. Instead, she begins to question your choices, your reactions, and your overall emotional strength in the dynamic. This shift does not happen from a single mistake. It builds gradually through repeated patterns that reduce her sense of admiration or emotional trust. When respect declines, attraction becomes unstable because emotional attraction is closely tied to perceived strength and clarity. At this stage, she is no longer interpreting your behavior with patience or benefit of the doubt. She begins to interpret actions more critically. Small behaviors that were once ignored or forgiven now carry more emotional weight. This is because her emotional filter has changed. She is no longer viewing you through the lens of admiration, but through the lens of evaluation. When she voices this directly, it often means she has already been feeling it internally for some time. The verbal expression is simply the point where internal judgment becomes external communication. In many cases, she may still be emotionally attached, but respect has become the dominant emotional filter. That creates a conflict where attachment exists, but admiration is weakened. This combination leads to emotional instability in the relationship dynamic. She may become distant, more argumentative, or less responsive because she is no longer emotionally aligned in the same way. At this stage, she begins to reassess whether the relationship structure still feels balanced to her. She evaluates whether she feels secure, heard, and emotionally grounded in the connection. If those elements are missing, respect continues to decline. Many men respond to this statement by trying to defend themselves or explain their behavior. However, respect is rarely rebuilt through explanation alone. It is influenced by consistent behavior over time. Her perception is shaped by patterns, not promises. When respect is questioned, she is essentially questioning the emotional leadership and stability she feels from you. If she no longer feels grounded in that presence, her emotional engagement weakens. This statement is also a reflection of internal emotional distance. A woman does not easily verbalize lack of respect unless she has already crossed a mental threshold where she feels detached enough to speak freely. That means emotional investment has already been compromised. Once respect is damaged, every interaction is filtered through that lens, making it harder for attraction to recover naturally. This is why this statement often marks a critical turning point in the relationship dynamic. 5. I think we should see other people. When a woman says she thinks you should see other people, it is one of the clearest signs that emotional separation has already begun in her mind. This statement is not usually spontaneous. It often reflects a decision that has been forming internally after a period of emotional detachment, dissatisfaction, or loss of attraction. At this stage, she is no longer fully invested in maintaining exclusivity or building a deeper connection with you. Instead, she is opening the door to emotional and relational alternatives. This does not always mean she already has someone else, but it does mean she is mentally preparing for a shift away from the current relationship structure. In modern dating dynamics, this statement represents emotional release. She is no longer trying to fix or improve the connection in her mind. She is preparing to step out of it while reducing emotional tension. When a woman reaches this point, her emotional attachment has already weakened significantly. The idea of staying fully committed no longer feels compelling enough to override her doubts or dissatisfaction. She may still have memories, familiarity, or comfort with you, but those are no longer strong enough to maintain exclusivity. This statement also reflects how she sees the future of the connection. Instead of imagining growth together, she now imagines separation as a more realistic path. Her mind begins to normalize the idea of distance and independence. In many cases, she has already emotionally disengaged before saying it, and the statement is simply the verbal alignment of her internal state. This is why men often feel surprised when they hear it, even though the emotional shift has been happening gradually over time. Another important layer of this statement is emotional self-justification. She is often trying to reduce internal conflict by framing separation as a mutual or fair decision. This allows her to move forward without feeling like she is abruptly abandoning the connection. It creates emotional relief by turning uncertainty into action. At this stage, her emotional investment in preserving the relationship is low, and her focus shifts toward personal emotional balance. She is more concerned with how she feels outside the relationship than how the relationship can be repaired. When this statement is made, the dynamic changes from building to releasing. The emotional energy is no longer directed toward repair or reconnection, but toward separation and exploration of alternatives. Even if communication continues, the emotional intent behind it is different. She is no longer communicating from a place of attachment, but from a place of emotional exit planning. In some cases, she may still feel moments of nostalgia or familiarity, but those feelings are no longer strong enough to reverse her direction. The relationship is now in a phase where emotional closure is being prepared internally, even if not yet fully executed externally. This statement marks a transition point where the emotional bond is no longer the primary driver of her decisions, and independence becomes the dominant internal focus. 6. You are not the same person anymore. When a woman says you are not the same person anymore, she is expressing a shift in perception that often carries more emotional weight than the words suggest. This statement means she has noticed a change in how she experiences you compared to earlier stages of the relationship. It is not always about physical change or obvious behavior differences. It is about emotional consistency, presence, and the way you show up in the dynamic over time. In attraction, consistency creates familiarity, and familiarity builds emotional security. When she feels that this consistency has changed, her emotional reference point shifts. She begins to compare who you are now with who she initially connected with. This comparison can create disappointment if the emotional experience no longer matches her expectations or memories. At this stage, she is no longer responding to you based on initial attraction alone. She is responding based on accumulated experiences. Every interaction becomes part of a larger emotional pattern in her mind. If she feels that your energy, attention, or emotional presence has changed in a way that reduces her emotional engagement, she begins to detach internally even if she is still physically present in the relationship. This statement often reflects emotional recalibration. She is trying to understand whether the current version of you still aligns with what she values emotionally. If the answer feels unclear or negative, her attraction weakens further. In many cases, this perception is not about one dramatic change, but about gradual shifts that have accumulated over time. Small inconsistencies, reduced emotional intensity, or changes in behavior can slowly alter how she experiences you. When she voices this, it means her internal comparison has reached a point where the difference is no longer subtle. Another important aspect of this statement is emotional expectation mismatch. She may have formed a certain emotional image of you based on early interactions. When reality no longer matches that image, disappointment begins to form. This does not always mean you have changed in a negative way objectively, but it means her emotional expectations are not being met in the same way. At this point, she starts to emotionally separate the past version of you from the present version. The past version may still hold positive emotional value, but the present version is being evaluated more critically. This creates emotional distance because attachment to memory does not always translate into attachment to reality. When a woman says this, she is also signaling reduced emotional adaptability. She is no longer easily adjusting to changes in the dynamic. Instead, she is noticing differences more sharply and evaluating them more strictly. This shift often leads to withdrawal if the emotional gap continues to grow. The statement reflects not only observation, but emotional conclusion forming in real time. She is beginning to decide whether the current version of the connection still meets her emotional needs or whether it has shifted too far from what she originally connected to. 7. I am not happy with you anymore. When a woman says she is not happy with you anymore, it represents a clear emotional conclusion rather than a passing feeling. At this stage, the emotional dissatisfaction has reached a level where it can no longer be ignored or minimized in her mind. Happiness in a relationship is tied to emotional fulfillment, consistency, and the overall experience she has with you over time. When she expresses this directly, it means those emotional needs are no longer being met in a way that feels meaningful to her. This statement often comes after a long internal process where she has already reflected on the relationship, compared her emotional state in different moments, and evaluated whether things have improved or declined. It is rarely based on a single incident. Instead, it is the result of accumulated emotional experiences that have created a clear internal judgment. At this point, she is no longer confused about how she feels. She has reached a level of clarity that the relationship is not giving her the emotional satisfaction she once expected or hoped for. This clarity is important because it signals emotional direction. She is no longer exploring whether things can improve in theory. She is recognizing how she feels in reality. When a woman reaches this stage, her emotional engagement is significantly reduced. She may still be present, still communicating, or still involved in daily interaction, but the emotional attachment that once drove her behavior is weakened. This creates a gap between presence and emotional investment. That gap often leads to emotional withdrawal, even if the relationship continues physically. Another important aspect of this statement is emotional acceptance. She is no longer resisting the truth of how she feels. Instead, she is acknowledging it openly. This acceptance often precedes action, whether that action is distancing, separation, or emotional disengagement. In many cases, she is already emotionally detached before saying it, and the statement simply confirms what has already formed internally. At this stage, attempts to argue, persuade, or convince her otherwise usually do not restore emotional attraction. This is because the issue is no longer lack of understanding, but lack of emotional fulfillment. Her focus shifts from trying to fix the relationship to recognizing her own emotional reality within it. She begins to prioritize how she feels outside the relationship compared to how she feels inside it. If the outside feels lighter, calmer, or more fulfilling, her mind naturally leans toward detachment. This statement also reflects emotional finality. It is not an exploratory language. It is declarative. She is not asking questions about the relationship. She is stating her internal conclusion. This is why it often carries a strong emotional weight. It signals that her emotional journey within the relationship has reached a stopping point unless something fundamentally changes her experience. At this stage, The emotional direction is already set, and what follows is usually a progression towards separation or emotional closure rather than rebuilding. When a woman says any of these 7 things, it is not random talk. It is emotional communication that reflects where her mind has already moved internally. Each statement shows a different stage of emotional detachment, from uncertainty to numbness to withdrawal to final conclusion. Most men focus on reacting to the words instead of understanding the emotional process behind them. By the time these statements are spoken, the real shift has already happened inside her mind. The attraction has already weakened, the emotional connection has already changed, and her internal evaluation has already moved forward. Modern relationships move fast, and emotions shift quietly before they are ever expressed out loud. These statements are signals that her emotional experience is no longer aligned with the relationship she once had with you. What matters most is not the sentence itself, but the pattern behind it. Whether it is loss of excitement, loss of respect, or loss of emotional fulfillment, once that pattern is strong enough, she begins to verbalize it clearly, not as a question, but as a reflection of her internal truth. At that point, the relationship is no longer in a building phase. It is in a deciding phase where direction is already forming. A man who understands this does not wait for repeated signals. He recognizes the meaning early and responds with awareness and self-respect rather than emotional reaction. Because once emotional attraction declines to this level, words become confirmation, not confusion, and what she says simply reveals what she has already decided inside.